Hey, welcome to WTF History, where we dig into the wildest, most mind-blowing stories from the past that'll leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. Today, we're diving into a tale that's equal parts inspiring, heartbreaking, and downright insane. The story of Eulalia, a 13-year-old girl who walked straight into the jaws of the Roman Empire in 304 AD and changed history forever. Picture this. It's winter in Emerita Augusta, modern-day Merida, Spain. The marble corridors of this bustling Roman city echo with the footsteps of a girl, barely taller than the soldiers around her, marching toward her death with a fire in her eyes that could burn through stone. This isn't just any execution, and she's not just any kid. Her name is Eulalia, and what she did in her final hours became a haunting testament to courage, faith, and defiance that shook an empire. So, grab a seat, because this story is going to take you on a ride through history you won't forget. Let's set the scene, because to get why Eulalia's story is such a big deal, you need to understand the absolute chaos of the Roman Empire at the dawn of the 4th century. This wasn't a Rome of gladiators and golden triumphs you might imagine. No, this was a Rome on the brink. Emperor Diocletian, a guy who'd clawed his way from humble roots to become one of Rome's toughest rulers, was staring down a perfect storm. Barbarian tribes were pounding at the borders. The economy was crashing harder than a chariot with a busted wheel, and internal bickering was threatening to tear the empire apart. Diocletian, like any good Roman, figured the gods were angry. And who was to blame? Not the endless wars or crippling taxes. Oh no, it was those Christians refusing to bow to the old Roman gods or burn incense for the emperor's divine genius. To Diocletian, they weren't just a problem. They were a disease eating away at Rome's soul. On February 24th, 303 AD, Diocletian dropped a bombshell, an edict that kicked off the Great Persecution, the most brutal, systematic attempt to wipe Christianity off the map. Churches were to be burned, sacred texts torched, Christian property seized. If you were a Christian in government or the military, you had a choice. Sacrifice to Jupiter or lose everything. Your job, your home, maybe your life. This edict spread like wildfire, hitting every corner of the empire, including Emerita Augusta, a city that was no backwater. Founded by Emperor Augustus for retired soldiers, this place was a Roman jewel in Hispania. Picture grand temples gleaming under the Spanish sun, aqueducts feeding luxurious baths, and villas decked out with mosaics that screamed wealth. Merchants from across the Mediterranean filled it. Markets with spices, glass, and silks. But beneath this polished surface, something was stirring. Christianity was taking root, not just among slaves and the poor, but among the elite. Wealthy family with a dangerous secret. They were Christians. History didn't bother to record her parents' names, but we know they were crypto-Christians navigating a society where religious conformity wasn't just expected, it was the law. They raised Eulalia in a bubble of privilege, teaching her to read not just classics like Virgil and Homer, but the forbidden Christian texts that could get you killed. This wasn't your average kid. Ancient sources like the poet Prudentius, who wrote about her a century later, describe her as a firecracker, fiercely smart, stubborn as hell. Even when her parents begged her to tone it down. You can almost hear them, "Eulalia, please, you're going to get us all in trouble." But this girl, she wasn't about to hide. When Diocletian's edict hit, Emerita Augusta in the spring of 303, the city's Christians were thrown into a panic. Some fled to the countryside. Others faked loyalty to the Roman gods while praying to Christ in secret. And a few braced for martyrdom. The local governor, a guy named Dacian, got to work with the efficiency of a Roman bureaucrat, torching house churches and rounding up Christian leaders. He set up public altars where everyone had to sacrifice and get a certificate proving they played ball. For Eulalia's parents, the plan was simple: get their outspoken daughter out of the city before she did something reckless. They whisked her off to their countryside villa, surrounded by olive groves and vineyards, far from the prying eyes of imperial officials. It was the perfect hideout, a place where she could pray in peace and wait out the storm. But here's where things take a wild turn. Eulalia wasn't having it. To her, hiding while her fellow Christians suffered wasn't safety, it was betrayal. She spent days praying, fasting, wrestling with a choice that's hard for us to even imagine. A 13-year-old deciding to face death head-on. Picture this. It's a freezing December night. The villa's quiet. Everyone's asleep. Eulalia, barely a teenager, slips out with a single companion. Maybe a servant. Maybe another young Christian named Julia. They trek through the dark, miles of rugged terrain until they hit the city at dawn. The forum's waking up, temples glowing in the early light, and this kid storms in and does something absolutely insane. She doesn't just turn herself in. She stands in the middle of the forum and lets loose a speech that stops everyone cold. According to ancient accounts, she called the Roman gods demons, their temples houses of lies, and the emperor a servant of Satan. She took aim at Jupiter, mocking him as an adulterer and tyrant, and laughed at the idea of worshiping a human emperor. The crowd, at first chuckling at what they thought was a kid's tantrum, went dead silent. This wasn't a game. This girl was signing her own death warrant, and she knew it. Governor Dacian was floored. Here's a guy used to dealing with rebels and fanatics, but a 13-year-old noble girl? That's a whole different beast. He tried to talk her down, pointing out her youth, her family status, the life she could have, marriage, wealth, the works, if she'd just burn a pinch of incense. Some sources say he even suggested she fake it, just say the words and go home. But Eulalia doubled down. In front of everyone, she knocked over the altar, scattered the incense, and, get this, spat at the emperor's image. That's not just defiance. That's a middle finger to the entire Roman system. Under Roman law, that kind of sacrilege meant one thing: punishment swift and severe. But even then, Dacian hesitated. Killing a kid, especially one from a prominent family, was a political nightmare. Martyrs had a way of inspiring more trouble than they solved. So, he threw her in prison, hoping a night in a dank, rat-infested cell would scare some sense into her. But Eulalia didn't break. Christian sources say she spent the night singing hymns, her voice echoing through the prison, lifting the spirits of other prisoners and freaking out the guards. By morning, word of her stunt had spread like wildfire. Crowds gathered in the forum, buzzing with curiosity and dread. Dacian was stuck. Let her go, and he'd look weak. Kill her, and he'd hand the Christians a martyr. What happened next is where this story goes from wild to haunting, pulling us right into the heart of her defiance and the empire's desperation to crush it. The forum in Emerita Augusta is packed now, the air thick with tension. The sun's climbing over the temples, and Governor Dacian's sweating bullets. He's got a 13-year-old girl who's turned his public altar into a punching bag, spitting in the face of Roman authority and calling their gods a sham. This isn't just a kid throwing a tantrum. It's a direct challenge to the empire's power, and Dacian knows it. The crowds, watching, half horrified, half mesmerized as this tiny figure stand her ground. Dacian's first instinct was to toss her in prison, hoping the cold, dark cell would break her. But Eulalia is not breaking. Ancient sources say she spent the night praying and singing, her voice carrying through the prison like a beacon. Other prisoners, probably scared out of their minds, found courage in her. Words. The guards? They're rattled. This isn't how it's supposed to go. By morning, the whole city's talking about the girl who won't back down. The forum's filled with people, merchants, soldiers, housewives, even kids, craning their necks to see what happens next. Dacian's in a bind. If he lets Eulalia go, he looks like a pushover, and Rome doesn't tolerate weak governors. But if he kills her, he risks turning her into a martyr, which is the last thing the empire needs. Christians were already a thorn in Rome's side, and a public execution of a kid could pour fuel on that fire. So, Dacian tries one last time to get her to play ball. He brings her out, probably looking small and fragile next to the armored soldiers, and makes an offer. Just burn a little incense. Say a few words to Jupiter, and she can walk away. He might have even leaned in, all fatherly, saying, "Look, kid, you don't have to mean it. Just do it and go home." But Eulalia is not here for compromises. She's 13, but she's got the conviction of a warrior. She refuses flat out, and the crowd gasps. This is when things get dark. Dacian, out of options and probably furious, orders the tortures to begin. Roman torture was no joke. These guys knew how to make an example of someone. The tradition of 13 tortures for 13 years might be symbolic, but the accounts we have, from poets like Prudentius and later Christian texts, don't hold back on the details. They started with flogging, leather whips cracking against her skin, designed to hurt like hell, but not kill right. Away. When that didn't break her, they stepped it up to scourges, metal-tipped whips that could tear flesh clean off the bone. Imagine the sound. The crowd's murmurs turning to silence as they realize this kid isn't screaming or begging. Instead, she's praying, singing. Witnesses say she looked almost serene, like the pain was just background noise to her faith. That's not normal. That's the kind of thing that makes you question everything you know about human endurance. The torturers are starting to lose it. They're used to people cracking under this kind of pain, grown men, hardened criminals, not a 13-year-old girl. So they escalate. Iron hooks come out, ripping into her sides, a punishment usually saved for the worst of the worst. Then burning torches, pressed against her wounds, the smell of charred flesh filling the forum. The crowd's shifting uncomfortably now. Some are crying, others can't look. Even the soldiers who've seen it all are starting to falter. Eulalia is not just enduring this. She's turning it into something else. Some sources say she taunted her torturers, throwing shade at their gods like, "Is that all you've got?" Others say she stayed calm, her lips moving in prayer, her eyes fixed on something no one else could see. Either way, the dynamic's shifting. This isn't a show of Roman power anymore. It's a show of her power, a kind of strength that's freaking everyone out. The tortures get worse. Boiling oil, molten lead poured over her wounds. These aren't standard procedures. They're the kind of thing you pull out for traitors or slaves who've killed their masters. For a kid, it's unheard of. It's like Dacian's losing control, desperate to break her before she breaks him. Dacian's spectacle, meant to scare Christians into submission, is backfiring. Eulalia's turning his stage into her pulpit, her suffering into a sermon. And it's working. At some point, there's a pause. Maybe the torturers are exhausted. Maybe Dacian's hoping she'll finally crack. According to the stories, this is when Eulalia does something incredible. She doesn't beg for mercy. She doesn't cry for her parents. She starts preaching. Right there, in the middle of the forum, with her body torn to pieces, she talks about resurrection, eternal life, a kingdom built on love. Not fear, Whether she actually said these words or Christian writers later put them in her mouth, it doesn't matter. The point is, she flipped the script. Rome valued power, control, domination. Eulalia is talking about something else entirely. A power that doesn't need swords or whips, a kingdom that outlasts empires. The crowd's eating it up, and Dacian knows he's losing. Finally, he's had enough. He orders her burned alive, a public execution meant to end this once and for all. They build a pyre right there in the forum, a big screw you to anyone thinking of following her. The flames roar, and Eulalia is tied to the stake. But even this doesn't go as planned. Witnesses, probably Christians, but maybe some pagans too, swear they saw something unreal. As the fire consumed her, a dove flew out of her mouth, soaring into the sky. Then, out of nowhere, snow falls, covering her burned body like a white shroud. You might be thinking, come on, that's got to be made up. Maybe it is. But whether it's true or not, these details tell us something huge. Eulalia's death hit people hard. They needed to believe something beautiful came out of this. Horror that her soul didn't just vanish but ascended, pure and untouched. That snow? It's like the universe itself was mourning her, wrapping her in dignity when Rome tried to strip it away. But Dacian's victory was short-lived, and this is where the story takes a turn that flips history on its head. He thought he'd crushed a rebel, sent a message, tied up a loose end. He was dead. Wrong. Eulalia's death didn't scare Christians. It lit a fire under them. Right after she died, Christians risked everything to claim her body, sneaking it away for a proper burial. Flowers started appearing at her grave, prayers whispered in secret. Dacian's reports to Rome probably bragged about taking out a troublemaker, but on the ground, it was a different story. Eulalia was already becoming a legend, a symbol of defiance that spread faster than Rome could contain. Her grave became a secret shrine almost overnight, with people leaving offerings, lighting candles in the dark. This wasn't just grief, it was resistance. Every flower at her tomb was a quiet rebellion against Rome's crackdown. Word of her story didn't stay in Emerita Augusta. It went viral, 4th century style. Christians across the empire, from Gaul to Africa, started hearing about the 13-year-old who mocked the emperor, endured unimaginable pain, and went out like a legend. Travelers carried her story along Roman roads. Merchants whispered it in markets, and Christian communities shared it in their secret meetings. Eulalia wasn't just a girl anymore. She was a symbol, proof that faith could outlast swords and flames. And here's the crazy part. Within a decade, 10 years, the empire that killed her started to crumble under the weight of the very faith it tried to crush. In 313 AD, Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, legalizing Christianity across the empire. Christians could worship openly, no more hiding, no more altars to Jupiter. By 380 AD, under Emperor Theodosius, Christianity wasn't just legal. It was the official religion of Rome. The gods Eulalia died for refusing to worship. Their temples were abandoned, turned into churches, or left to rot. Jupiter, Mars, all those heavy hitters of Roman mythology, they were out and Christ was in. Think about that for a second. The empire that burned a 13-year-old girl alive for her faith ended up bowing to that same faith. Governor Dacian, he's barely a footnote, remembered only as the guy who killed a saint. Eulalia, on the other hand, got basilicas built in her honor. Her tomb in Merida became one of the biggest pilgrimage sites in Hispania, drawing people from across Europe. The poet Prudentius penned a hymn to her that churches sang for over 1,000 years. Artists painted her, not as a broken victim, but as a radiant saint holding the whips and flames that killed her like they were trophies. It's like she took Rome's weapons and turned them into her badges of honor. Her story didn't just inspire Christians. It shook some pagans too, making them question their gods. Why would a kid go through that? What kind of power was she tapping into? This is where Eulalia's story starts to transcend her time and place, pulling us into the broader currents of history and human experience. She became more than a martyr. She became an archetype. To young women, she was a model of courage and purity, someone who said no to a world that told her to sit down and shut up. To theologians, she raised big questions. Why does God let a kid suffer? Like that? What's the point of martyrdom? To communities under pressure, she was a reminder that resistance could outlast oppression. Her story got retold, reshaped, embellished with every generation, but the core stayed the same. A girl who chose principle over survival, faith over fear. It forced people to ask themselves, what would I do? What's worth standing up for? Even if it costs everything? As her fame grew, so did the legends. Some said there were two Eulalias, one in Merida, another in Barcelona, because her story was too big to be contained in one place. Churches dedicated to her popped up from Spain to France. Each community took her story and made it their own, weaving it into their struggles, their hopes. In Merida, her tomb became a spiritual hub, a place where people came to pray, to heal, to feel connected to something bigger. Archaeologists have found evidence of this. Layers of construction over her grave, from a simple tomb to a massive basilica, showing how her memory grew over centuries. This wasn't just a story. It was a movement, one that carried her name across the Roman world and beyond, setting the stage for the next chapter of her legacy. By the 5th and 6th centuries, Eulalia's tomb in Merida was more than a grave. It was a spiritual powerhouse, drawing pilgrims who'd walk for weeks, sometimes months, to pray there. This wasn't just about devotion, it was big business. Pilgrimage sites like her basilica were economic engines, with merchants selling candles, tiny statues, bits of cloth touched too. Her tomb as relics. Innkeepers made bank, and the city thrived. But it wasn't just about money. Pilgrims came looking for hope, healing, a connection to a girl who'd faced the worst, and in their eyes, her story gave them strength, whether they were facing persecution, illness, or just the grind of medieval life. As Christianity spread, her name went global. Well, global for the time. Churches dedicated to her popped up from Barcelona to Bordeaux, each place tweaking her story to fit their needs. For some, she was the ultimate rebel, sticking it to the man. For others, she was a model of purity, a young woman who said no to marriage and wealth for something bigger. For theologians, she was a puzzle. How do you make sense of a kid suffering like that? What does it say about God, about faith, about the world? By the medieval period, Eulalia was a superstar saint, especially for the Mozarabic Christians in Spain, living under Islamic rule. They were under constant pressure to convert, and her defiance mirrored their own struggles. They saw her as one of them, a symbol of sticking to your faith no matter what. Her story even inspired one of the earliest pieces of French literature, the sequence of Saint Eulalia, written in the 9th century, a big deal if you're into the history of language and poetry. Crusaders, gearing up for their holy wars, shouted her name before charging into battle, seeing her as proof that faith could conquer any enemy, even one as big as Rome. Every group that latched onto her story found something different in it, like a mirror reflecting their own struggles. But let's not sugarcoat this. Eulalia's story is dark. A 13-year-old choosing death, enduring tortures that make your stomach turn. not feel-good material. By the Counter-Reformation in the 16th and 17th centuries, the Catholic Church leaned hard into stories like hers to counter Protestant challenges. They wanted to show that faith could trump reason, that tradition was stronger than new ideas. Baroque artists went all out, painting her in vivid, emotional scenes, blood, flames, and a serene face that said, "I'm above." These weren't just art. They were meant to hit you in the gut, to make you feel the power of her sacrifice. The Jesuits, who were spreading Catholicism like wildfire, used her story to inspire converts, especially young people. A 13-year-old giving everything for her faith? That's the kind of example that makes you want to sign up. But this is where things get tricky. The more her story was used, the more it got shaped to fit the church's needs. Her youth, her virginity, her suffering, they weren't just details. They were tools to push a narrative about purity and obedience, especially for women. Feminist scholars in the 20th century started calling this out. They saw Eulalia as a badass, a girl who rejected every expectation society threw at her: marriage, motherhood, silence, and chose her own path. But they also noticed how the stories about her often focused on her body, her purity, the violence done to her. There's a creepy undercurrent in a lot of Martyr narratives where female defiance is celebrated but also sexualized, like the threat of violence was part of the point. Eulalia's age makes it even more unsettling. She's both a child and a woman. Innocent but defiant, a victim who somehow comes out on top. That tension reflects how complicated female power was, and still is, in a world run by men. Her story both challenged and reinforced those norms, celebrating her strength while boxing it into a specific kind of holy femininity. And then there's the question of her choice. A 13-year-old choosing death. That's hard to swallow. Today we'd be asking about coercion, indoctrination, whether a kid that young can even make that kind of decision. Modern psychology might slap a label on her: religious mania, rebellion gone too far. But in her world, her decision wasn't crazy. It was heroic. If you believed in eternal life, if you saw suffering as a path to glory, then walking into that forum made sense. It's just that our modern lens, which puts survival and safety first, struggles to get it. This is where her story starts to pull us into deeper waters, asking us to think about what her sacrifice means. Not just for her time, but for ours. That question of sacrifice got new life in the colonial period, when Spanish missionaries took Eulalia's story to the Americas. They used her as an example to push indigenous people to abandon their traditional religions, sometimes with brutal consequences. Young converts, inspired by her, faced rejection or worse from their communities. In Mexico and Peru, her feast day got blended with local traditions, creating something new, a mix of Christian and indigenous elements that would have shocked both Roman pagans and early Christians. This shows how universal her story was, speaking to people across cultures, but also how it could be twisted to serve power. By the 19th century, the Romantic movement got hold of her story and turned it into something almost syrupy. Victorian poets and painters loved her, but they softened the edges, making her the ultimate innocent girl destroyed by cruel men. It was less about her faith, and more about their own obsessions with fragile femininity. Girls named Eulalia started popping up all over Catholic countries, a nod to how her story had been domesticated into a model of pious girlhood. But even these watered-down versions couldn't erase the raw power of what she did. By the 20th century, her story was being pulled in new directions, and this is where it slams into modern conflict. During the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, Spain was tearing itself apart. Nationalists fighting for a traditional Catholic Spain, Republicans pushing for a secular, progressive vision. Both sides looked at Eulalia and saw something they could use. For the nationalists, she was the ultimate symbol of Catholic resistance, a girl who stood up to a godless empire and died for her. Faith. They held her up as proof that their fight against communism was holy. But the Republicans saw her differently, a victim of authoritarian power, a kid crushed by a system that demanded conformity. Her youth and innocence made her a perfect metaphor for their own struggle against what they saw as fascist oppression. Churches and shrines tied to her were caught in the crossfire, some destroyed, others rebuilt as symbols of victory, depending on who held the ground. This tug-of-war shows how powerful her story was. It wasn't just a dusty old tale. It could be weaponized, twisted to fit whatever narrative people needed. The fact that both sides could claim her a rebel for one, a martyr for the other, says something profound about martyrdom stories. They're like prisms, reflecting whatever light you shine through them. By the time the Second Vatican Council rolled around in the 1960s, the Catholic Church started rethinking how it told stories like Eulalia's. They took a hard look at saint cults, questioning how much was history and how much was legend. Some martyrs got downgraded, their stories deemed too shaky. But Eulalia passed the test. They talked about her. Instead of focusing on the gory details of her torture, they leaned into her courage, her faith, her witness to God's love. It was a deliberate move, reflecting a world that was starting to shy away from glorifying suffering, especially a child's suffering. Modern Catholics were taught to see her as a model of standing firm, not a poster child for pain. Her beliefs. That's not something we can just breeze past. In Eulalia's time, her choice was seen as heroic, a triumph over a godless empire. But today, we'd be horrified. Was she brainwashed? Was her family pushing her too hard? Did she even understand what she was getting into? Modern psychology might call it religious mania, adolescent rebellion, or a trauma response. But slapping a label on her doesn't do her justice. In her world, martyrdom wasn't a mental health issue. It was a badge of honor. If you believed eternal life was real, that this world was just a pit stop, then facing torture for your faith was the ultimate flex. Eulalia's choice only makes sense in that context, where dying for truth was noble, not tragic. But that context feels so far from ours. Today, we put kids' safety above everything. The idea of a 13-year-old walking into death for any cause sets off alarm bells. We'd be calling child protective services, not building basilicas. And yet, Eulalia didn't see herself as a victim. She saw herself as a warrior. When she stormed into that forum, denounced the Roman gods, and spat at the emperor's image, she was claiming power in a world that wanted to strip it from her. Feminist scholars love this about her. They see her as a radical, a girl who said no to every role society handed her, daughter, future wife, obedient citizen, and chose something bigger. But they also point out the darker side of how her story's been told. The focus on her virginity, the lingering descriptions of her torture, the way her body became a canvas for both violence and sanctity. It's got a creepy edge. Martyr narratives like hers often walk a fine line, celebrating female strength while tying it to suffering and purity in ways that feel controlling. Eulalia is both a hero and a cautionary tale, a symbol of agency and a reminder of how that agency got packaged for a patriarchal world. This tension between empowerment and exploitation shows up in how her story's been used over time. In the colonial period, Spanish missionaries used her as an example to push indigenous people to abandon their religions. sometimes with brutal consequences. In Mexico and Peru, her feast day got mixed with local traditions, creating something new but also showing how her story could be a tool for cultural conquest. By the 19th century, the Romantic movement turned her into a tragic heroine, pure, innocent, destroyed by cruel men. It was less about her faith and more about Victorian anxieties about women and purity. Girls named Eulalia popped up everywhere, a nod to how her story had been softened into a model of pious girlhood. But even these sanitized versions couldn't erase the raw edge of what she did. Her story also connects to how we process trauma. The Christians who turned her execution site into a pilgrimage spot, who made her torture tools into sacred symbols, were doing something profound. They were taking a moment of horror and giving it meaning. That's a human instinct, not just a Christian one. We see it in memorials, in art, in the stories we tell about our worst moments. But it's tricky. Turning suffering into a triumph can inspire, but it can also glorify pain in ways that feel wrong. Modern critics, especially those looking at how her story's been told, worry about this. The focus on her torn body, her purity, her youth. It can feel like we're celebrating the violence, not the person. And when it's a kid, that hits even harder. We're more aware now of how stories like hers can be used to push agendas, to make suffering seem noble when maybe it's just tragic. Art and ritual have kept her memory alive, but they've also changed it. Early medieval paintings showed her as a triumphant adult, brushing off her pain. Later ones, especially in the Baroque era, leaned into the gore, making her a child racked with agony, but still serene. Today's artists often avoid the subject or go abstract, maybe because we're less comfortable with a kid's suffering being the star of the show. Her feast day in Merida, December 10th, is still a big deal. Processions, songs, bread blessed in her name. It's not just religious, it's cultural, tying the city to its past. Even secular folks in Merida see her as part of their cities. DNA, proof that her story's bigger than any one belief. This brings us to the political side of things, because Eulalia's story isn't just about faith, it's about power. When she called the Roman gods demons, she wasn't just dissing religion, she was challenging the entire Roman system. The emperor wasn't just a ruler, he was a god, and refusing to sacrifice to him was like flipping off the state. Her execution was Rome's way of saying, know your place. But she won. Within a decade, Christianity was legalized, and by 380 AD, it was Rome's official religion. The persecuted became the establishment, the rebels became the rulers. But that victory came with complications. When Christianity took over, martyrs like Eulalia went from outlaws to official saints, their stories used to prop up the new Christian empire. It's a classic case of the underdog becoming the boss, and it raises questions. How do you stay true to a message of resistance when you're the one in power? Her story also ties into bigger patterns of religious violence. Jewish, Islamic, Buddhist, Hindu traditions all have their own stories of young people choosing death over compromise. The details change, but the core is the same: individual conscience versus state power. Eulalia's story is uniquely Christian, tied to ideas of martyrdom and resurrection, but it's also universal, speaking to anyone who's ever stood up to a system bigger than them. And that's why it's lasted, because it's not just about her, it's about all of us, about what we do when the world demands we bend. Now, let's get to the heart of it. What does a 13-year-old choosing death mean today, in 2025? In her time, her decision was heroic, a triumph of faith. But now, we'd be horrified. A child walking into torture raises every red flag. Was she free to make that choice? Or was she shaped by a world that glorified martyrdom? Modern psychology might call it fanaticism, maybe a trauma response. But in her context, her choice wasn't irrational. It was the ultimate act of agency. She believed in a reality beyond this world, where suffering for truth was a ticket to eternity. That's a worldview we struggle to grasp because for us, protecting kids is non-negotiable, and survival trumps everything. Her story forces us to ask, is there anything worth dying for? And even tougher, is there anything worth a child dying for? In today's world, we'd say no, full stop. Kids are supposed to be shielded, not sacrificed. But Eulalia's story challenges that. She wasn't just a victim. She was an actor in her own drama, choosing a path that gave her life meaning, even if it ended it. This question ties into bigger ethical debates. Take religious freedom. Eulalia's story is one of the earliest examples of someone dying for their right to believe, and it's still relevant. In 2025, we're seeing people persecuted for their beliefs, Uyghurs in China, Christians in parts of Africa, and others. Her story is a reminder that these fights have deep roots, but also complicates things. How do you defend someone's right to their faith without endorsing choices that lead to harm? How do you protect a kid's autonomy while keeping them safe? Human rights groups point to Eulalia as a symbol of resistance, but they focus on her courage, not the idea that death is the goal. Her story pushes us to think about how we protect belief without endorsing extremism. Then there's the theological angle. Why would God let a kid go through that? Why no miraculous rescue? Just a dove and snow after the fact. Different Christian traditions have wrestled with this. Some say her suffering was redemptive, a path to glory. Others see her as a sign that God suffers with the oppressed, not above them. There's no easy answer, and that's the point. Her story forces believers to grapple with innocent suffering, especially when it's a child. It's not just a question for Christians. Any worldview that tries to make sense of pain has to deal with stories like hers. In our digital age, Eulalia has found new life online. There are websites, forums, even social media pages where people share prayers, artwork, or stories of how she's inspired them. Video games and graphic novels turn her into a kind of superhero, sometimes a warrior saint, sometimes a tragic hero. But the internet's a double-edged sword. It's also a place where people question her story, especially the parts that glorify a child's suffering. Social media debates dig into whether we should even celebrate martyrdom, or if it's a dangerous relic of a world that valued death over life. That push and pull is what keeps her story alive, because it forces us to wrestle with it, not just nod along. Archaeology backs up the basics of her story. The forum where she likely died, the prison where she might have prayed, the layers of her tomb, showing centuries of veneration. The details, the dove, the snow, the 13 tortures, are probably symbolic, ways to give meaning to a brutal death. But whether it's fact or myth, her story's power lies in what it represents. The human need to find transcendence in tragedy, hope, and horror. She was a 13-year-old who faced a system that tried to crush her and came out, in the eyes of millions, as the victor. Her story's been told for 1,700 years, through hymns, paintings, wars, and tweets, because it speaks to something deep in us. The need to believe that even the worst moments can lead to something more. So what does Eulalia's story mean today? It's a challenge, a call to think about what we value and why. Is the physical world all there is, making her death a senseless waste? Or is there something bigger, something that turns a brutal ending into a new beginning? Her story doesn't answer that. It just makes you ask it. And that's why, all these centuries later, we're still talking about her. Thanks for joining us on this journey through one of history's wildest stories. If this hit you as hard as it hit us, drop a comment, share your thoughts, and let us know what other crazy tales you want us to dig into. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you never miss an episode of WTF History. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and we'll see you soon.